All right, everyone. We're going to get started. We normally have the academic 10 minutes, but this time we're going to get going because we would like to get to our speaker. I'm going to be very scripted. Peter just told me he likes to be unscripted, so I'm going to keep to the time I allotted myself. So welcome everyone to the last of our public events this semester, the Annual Tang Lecture in Silk Road Studies. And we're especially happy to welcome Peter Frankopan, who is here to provide us with some food for thought on the concept of the Silk Road. Now, we had originally imagined this event in conjunction with a two-day conference on so-called big questions in Silk Road studies, questions surrounding migration, human population, networks, genetics, climate, adaptation, etc. But unfortunately, the timing didn't work, so we moved the conference to late October 2024. So if you're interested in that conference, then please check our website. Now, concerning the topic of the Tang Annual Lecture today, from its inception, I think the Tang Center recognized the imperative to critically examine the term Silk Roads, challenging and expanding conventional notions about this discipline. Could an invented term yet again be reinvented to help tackle the challenges of the study of ancient global connectivity without risking being marred by its association with modern imperial projects? Could it underscore the importance of the global without losing track of the local, emphasizing both universality and particularity? Now, despite some scholars' outright rejection or rejecting or hesitating to embrace the notion of the Silk Road, we firmly believe that its constructed nature offers a fertile ground for scholarly exploration, because it's by its very definition as a geohistorical metaphor, the Silk Road really encourages interdisciplinary and transnational approaches to research, fostering a deeper understanding of global connectivity while retaining a keen awareness of local contexts. So today we are very glad to have Peter Frankopan among us, Professor of Global History at Oxford. Professor Frankopan also serves as the director of the Oxford Center for Byzantine Research and holds the position of Senior Research Fellow at Worcester College. He's also UNESCO Professor of Silk Road Studies at King's College, Cambridge. With a vast array of research interests spanning continents and epochs, his scholarly pursuits shed light on the intricate webs of Eurasian connectivities, elucidating the exchange of ideas, goods, and cultures across time and space. Professor Frankopan's scholarly contributions extend far and wide, encompassing the rich histories and political landscapes of the Mediterranean, Russia, the Middle East, Persia, Iran, Central Asia, and China. Moreover, his exploration of topics such as climate, natural resources, and global interconnectedness continues, I think, to enrich our understanding of humanity's shared narrative. So within the meticulous scholarship of this academic work lies a wealth of detailed analysis and intellectual richness, offering a comprehensive exploration of its subject matter through insightful, at least I think, interpretations and thought-provoking arguments. Peter Frankopan sheds new light on familiar concepts and challenges existing paradigms, pushing the boundaries of knowledge in their field. His work is not simply a compilation of facts and theories, but I think it offers a deeper understanding of the subject and inspires further inquiry and debate. His remarkable body of work has garnered widespread acclaim, with 3 of his recent publications emerging as bestsellers and earning prestigious accolades. Most recently, The Earth Transformed, An Untold History, unfolds how climate change has dramatically shaped the development and demise of civilizations across time. Before that, and perhaps more pertinent to his topic today, were in 2015, The Silk Roads, A New History of the World, followed by, in 2018, if I'm correct, The New Silk Roads, The Present and Future of the World, for which he also received numerous awards. The latter, a work that locates Asia and the new Silk Roads at the center of the world today. Now, all his books have been widely translated and have global reach. I'm very happy that his in-person global reach now has extended to Berkeley. Now, before I invite Peter to the podium, I just want to say that our speaker has a very busy schedule ahead of him and won't be able to hang back, if you will, too long after his talk. But I'm hoping that there will be some time for a few questions and discussion. So with that, please help me welcome Peter Frankopan.
Thank you very much, Sanjot. I feel like a sort of racehorse being primed to go out of the starting gate. How's that? Everybody can hear. Shout if you can't. And if any point I say something you don't understand, or I mean, ideally, if you don't agree with me, save it. But if you don't understand, I'm aware I bring my Oxford accent with me. It's a huge privilege to be here. I had a fantastic lunch today, talking to some of the people who've been involved with the Tang Centre for Silk Road Studies since before it was established, and those who've been critically involved since. So it's a huge pleasure and a privilege to see friends here as well. So thank you very much for inviting me. It's always tricky to give talks like this because there's going to be a range of interests, a range of specialisms, ranges of knowledge. I don't like to read from a script because otherwise I might as well send it in by Zoom. So I much prefer to try and think about what might be interesting and the dangers of that. Well, I've been an academic for 35 years, so I know that when I go to talks and they're extremely obscure, however interesting they are, they're not always rewarding. So I'm going to try and wander around quite a few topics. And let's see how we get on. Right. First, those of you who are literally invested in the Silk Road Centre here at Berkeley or involved in the subject generally have picked a good subject. And I know that not just because I picked that subject, but because I look at the metrics. So behind I have a chart that measures the n-grams of how often we see Silk Road being used in all published books. And because Google have more or less digitized everything up until 2000, there wasn't that much interest 200 years ago, and now there's quite a lot. I looked, by the way, I'll say a little bit about whether Silk Road or Silk Roads. I'm very Catholic and welcoming to all denominations. Silk Road massively outscores Silk Roads. I quite like the plural, but I'm not particularly bothered either which way. But this is a good sign. If you're an investor, that's a good sign. That looks like Ethereum to me. That looks like that spike probably should go up. There needs a combination of lots of different things, PhD scholarships, postdocs, academic positions, people to buy books about the Silk Road or Silk Roads, but it turns out that people do that. Right. Now, if you want to have some really good news about how we're doing, those in this field, here we go. If you Google Silk Road, you get about 236 million hits. And that doesn't mean too much to anybody because you want to have some context. Is 236 million a lot in today's world? There's so much stuff being put online every single day. What's the benchmark? So I benchmarked it for you with a couple of quite well-known figures here, the former governor of California, Ronald Reagan, and Silk Road Studies does, what have we got, 54 million. So that's about 5 times more material about the Silk Roads, just in English language, than Ronald Reagan. That's quite a lot. Abraham Lincoln, I thought I can't just go local and whatever, but it's more than twice as popular as Abraham Lincoln, which really took me by surprise. I thought that these kind of subjects would completely dominate. I mean, it feels to me that we work in an area that has to use its elbows quite hard to get traction. So I'm both pleased but also quite surprised. So then I thought, okay, how do I measure it against the single most important thing on the internet? So I put in Taylor Swift. But that's still not bad. Silk Roads, about a third of the hits of Taylor Swift. If you'd asked me to guess, I'd have said it was in a fraction that you could measure in the hundredth. So I think that's quite a good place for us to be. It shows that there's a lot of interest. I'll talk about what some of that interest is, but that owes a lot to a lot of my colleagues, some of them here today, writing important books that allow us to think about the world in different ways. And I know one thing, which is to say thank you to my hosts. But this is a terrific new book that came out in 2022, produced by the home team here, The Maritime Silk Road. And this shows the vibrancy of the kinds of things that are going on in our subject. They're really exciting. They're difficult to connect lots of regions together. They're difficult to spread over time. But there's a lot of incredibly exciting work being done. And just showing a few things that have been written in the last few years. And a lot of these have found wide readerships. I'm much too modest to show you a picture of my own book, but there is a community of us working in different institutions around the world who are in an exciting, growing field where there's public interest. And that's a real privilege because it doesn't always work like that. We find new books that are trying to think about different ways of interpreting the Silk Road. This one, exciting and richly detailed, that says it's all about diplomacy rather than trade. That's totally fine by me. And I know when we hit the big time, when you start to see Silk Road in popular culture. So in vegetarianism, in Silk Road, what have we got here? A Uyghur cookbook, great. And Kyrgyzstan on a plate. It's quite exciting to see that. It's quite exciting to see novels that is Epic Adventure Series #1 do really well, and to see things like Silk Road Symphony Orchestras and, of course, Yo-Yo Ma, and then the kind of stuff we have to contend with, which is the parts of the world we're looking at. It's very undefined. I'll say a bit about geographies. I don't know what warring nations mean. But if there's an Orientalism, it's not about use of the word Silk Roads. That's about conceptualizing worlds in Asia as being aggressive, unstable, etc., etc. I'll say a few words about that, but it's a very telling headline. Because unless I'm mistaken, the levels of warfare in Central Asia, in Southeast Asia, East Asia, South Asia, maybe the Middle East, we have a slightly separate category, but east of Iran rather, this doesn't look to me all that bad. And if the wars have been started, it hasn't been started locally. Then you see Silk Roads turning up in fashions. As just so happens, I picked these out in China. This is a scenic spot, Gansu. Why show the monastery? Why show anything else? But it's a scenic spot. But the idea about Silk Roads being something that is not just about the past, that has a relevance in terms of culture, in terms of food, in terms of intangible heritage, I think it's a really interesting one. And it's not just in China here, my own home country, the Silk Road fashion, London, destiny. I mean, that's a fairly telling word too. I think it speaks to the fact that this word, this label, carries a lot of meanings. And that's quite interesting to me to think about what those are. Some of those, of course, are about trade and a new world order, about new states coming together, about GDP in Asia, about people moving around. Some of it's about how do you conceptualize, visualize, keep moving with BP Ultimate. I don't know what the camels did to get blamed for fossil fuel exploration, but that's just how things work. But these ideas of caravans as a metaphor for talking about a world that gets on quite well speaks very differently to that Yo-Yo Ma headline of warring nations. The idea of the Silk Road as having some kind of Pacific, cross-cultural, shared heritage is, I think, one of the reasons why we're all in this room today doing the things we do. Standard Chartered don't use this advert anymore. I'll say why. One Belt, One Road, One Bank. This was produced about 10 years ago at the height, really, of the Belt and Road Initiative, where the excitement around what might be in store has now given way to a whole set of other different interpretations. I'll say a few things about that too. But the idea that this was a good metaphor, that we could all talk about how we could build together, I think it's quite revealing for subjects like ours that have lots of regional specialization. Some of the scholars here have more discrete regions that they look at, but about how do we join big ideas together? How do we join geographies and periods up together? And the Silk Road lends itself, rightly or wrongly, into that kind of matrix of thinking about continuities, thinking about exchange. In 2015, this is Putin before he went mad, or maybe it was after he'd gone mad, decided that what he wanted to do in his summer holiday, unlike most of us, sit on a beach, have a glass of rosé. He went looking for Silk Road artifacts in the Black Sea. This is absolutely true. And probably not surprisingly, he emerged after about 45 minutes with two perfectly intact amphora dating to about 1000 BC. He's a luckier archaeologist than I am. when you work on subjects like ours, you spot things everywhere. So here in Colombo, the arrival, the VIP lounge. I didn't get a chance to go in there. I told them I was a famous author. I showed them my bag that says my Silk Roads, but I was politely told that anyway. But Silk Routes, that is the way in which you're greeted on arrival in one of the world's great island cultures. Here, this is Hermès. It's the poivre Samarkand that creates the smells, apparently, of the marketplaces of Central Asia. I lost my sense of smell about 30 years ago, probably because of dust mites, of reading books in the Bodleian libraries. It's true. Please don't laugh. Please don't laugh, because it makes it very hard to smell if someone's left the gas on at home, or to have the richness of having a fully sensory life. But so I can't tell you what this actually smells like, but I can tell you that the price tag is not a small one. So the Silk Road's being used to evoke high culture, exoticism, something that is desirable, is interesting. My local pub carries a Silk Road lychee infused beer that is perhaps not surprisingly not quite as popular as it might have been. But the idea that we see these Silk Roads across the world in different kind of contexts. Here, the late great Kobe Bryant was asked to design a trainer for Nike, and this is his Silk Road trainer that is supposed to evoke the colors, fabrics, textures of the peoples of the Silk Road and their cultures. And I don't know whether Kobe Bryant came up with that himself, but those who work in marketing think quite carefully about how to have global platforms that allow people to collaborate and put differences to one side. I have a pair of these. I've worn them once because they're too precious. They're going to be buried with me like a Viking chieftain one day. Then we have, Silk Roads being, adopted in places that most of us here in Berkeley or work in Silk Roads would never kind of really think about how Scotland and Singapore fit into the Silk Roads. Or here, Silk Road Scotland, the Tapestry Partnership. This is great for young people, by the way. I've never heard anybody say that before. The Silk Roads make me want to come to school. But, that's great that there's kind of catch-all of something that is substantial. There's something there that goes a long way past the kind of critiques of the label of the Silk Roads, which I'll say a few words about. We find here the Silk Roads. What's this one? The exclusive silk riding stocks or socks? Stocks. There we go. Here, where the Silk Road began. This is not how I think about how the Silk Road began, because I'm pretty sure it wasn't originally created in 1988 by Claire Hislop, although she obviously did something that was important in that year. But I think this idea of common ownership is important. So here, unfortunately, the Silk Road Deli, and then I've been looking for Silk Road restaurants here in California this afternoon. Here we go. This one is in, where is this? This is in Solvang. I'm afraid I'm not completely sure where Solvang is in California. Okay. Well, I because I'm supportive of everybody working on Silk Roads, I've left their phone number. Or if you want to do DoorDash, please support them. But the thing that's interesting about this is that this is Silk Roads. It's Mediterranean flavors. So Silk Roads gets and it's I think unfortunate use of the apostrophe. But anyway, that's a separate story, and they spent money on the logo on the wall too. But I think that adoption that the Silk Roads can mean everything to anybody. It can mean things to people making clothes in Scotland. It can mean to people making Mediterranean food in California. It can mean something to a basketball player creating trainers. And in fact, most famously, and looking around the audience, some of you will be, I was going to say, young enough, old enough, to know what this is. Oh dear, I'm on the move. My hang on, let me see. Somebody's moving this. I don't think it's me. Okay. Please don't Google this, by the way. The Silk Road was the name chosen by the initial dark web place where you can buy any form of very serious illegal drugs, weaponry, ballistic missiles on part of the dark web. And the fact that the Silk Road was adopted and named like that, it was shut down eventually by the FBI, is, I think, the idea about common marketplaces, places where you can do anything, where communities can gather and they can buy and trade regardless of their race, religion, identity, ethnicities, and so on, including whatever they particularly want to buy. I don't even know what half of this stuff is. You'll be pleased to know, but I know it's not good. I think that's quite interesting. It did get eventually shut down. One of the reasons why Silk Road, I think, has become highly contested in more recent times is partly because of Xi Jinping in Astana in 2013 announcing the so-called One Belt, One Road initiative, One Belt, One Road program, or the now Belt and Road, as we call it in English language, or Chinese government call it in English language. Although those of you who work on China will know it's more or less an extension of the Go West strategy of Hu Jintao. But anyway, the focus that was given because of China's purported investments, measured by some to potentially run up to $8 trillion, to be a new sort of neo-colonial project, sparked, I think, an idea that Silk Roads are imperialistic and they're about colonization. And whether that's right or not is a different story. I mean, some of the headlines when this came out, this title was written by the Chinese ambassador to the United Kingdom at the time. New Silk Road is an opportunity, not a threat. But how that has been seen elsewhere, particularly in this country, in the narratives of what China is or might be, or the threat that China might or might not pose in terms of indebtedness, of a trap, of a kind of master plan, and of a threat. And that's probably not been helpful for us working in the academic world, looking at Sogdian paintings and frescoes, where Silk Road's become something that is seen as being a Chinese project. I'll say a few words about that, of course. There's the context of, good luck, everybody. Vote carefully when the election comes. But, when you find senior American generals saying things like this, the news is not really great. Okay, so some of that around China's on the move and the fact that China used the Silk Roads as a label, and it deliberately evoking it in Xi Jinping's speech in 2013 and ever since, the configurations of the uses of the Silk Roads as a peaceful platform, as a mechanism for exchange, for trade, being quite amorphous in terms of where it actually is, has badged that project in many places, particularly in the West, as being something Chinese. That's not how the Silk Roads are seen in the individual countries that many of us here work on, which I'll give a couple of examples of that. But Sanjot said something about how the Silk Roads are contested as a label. And, some of those are useful conversations I think we have. I think labels, they do matter. I'm perfectly fine to call them step roads, although I suspect that David has smarter friends than I do, because when I start talking about steps, even my own family think I'm talking about my Apple Watch and how many I put in that day, rather than across the paths of Central Asia. But, then we have things that talking about when this label was invented. In fact, it wasn't invented in 1877. If we look at this engram on German terms, you find significant blips before Richthofen in 1877 in his famous article. In fact, the word Seidenstrassen is being used by German geographers significantly before the 1870s as a way, not in fact of talking about connections between Imperial China and Han Dynasty China and the Mediterranean, but in terms of connections between silk dispersals from China to Central Asia and to India. The fact that it got benchmarked later and being put into Richthofen's words is part of the reason why people don't like the label, because they think that it projects a form of Orientalism. In fact, there are lots of different ways in which silk could have been chosen, or spice, or incense. But silk is I think, is quite a good, useful catch-all, precisely because silk is rare, precisely because it's degradable, precisely because it's very difficult to find lots of really good examples from the past. So it means that there's an abstract quality to it, anyway, that I personally think is actually quite useful to project in other different ways. But other kinds of products are obviously being moved, normally small distances. Much more intense local connections than the long distance stuff. But in terms of capturing people's attentions, I think that is fine. Whether you think about ancient tea or horse or caravan roads, that's fine too. But then we have the kind of more problematic issues about, is this just a romantic deception? Or my friend Khordadad Rezekani, who's a quite influential article saying this doesn't actually exist at all. There is no such thing as trans-Eurasian exchange, which I think is a little bit bullish. But that's absolutely fine. I think that's what academic debate can look like. The problem is I'm less interested in the labels. I'm more interested in the substance. And one of the problems about the conceptualization of the Silk Roads is that the critiques about what the Silk Roads are or aren't tend to sit alongside people who are very happy to use these kinds of words and labels extremely easily. So I mean, I literally don't understand even today where the geography of Europe ends. It's obvious when you do Portugal and Spain and where the Atlantic gets you, but in terms of the Urals, has anybody even been to the Urals in this room? One? To the Urals? Two? Not many. So, I remember when I started doing history and I read about the Himalayas and I read about the Amazon Delta and I read about the Danube, I had no idea whether these are impassable mountain tracks. And I went to the Balkans to look at military routes for my PhD. I'd thought this was going to be like hiking through Tibet and Nepal, because the way it's been written about by other historians, and you could literally drive a lot, it's totally flat. The mountain passes are really not like in a Western where or when Indiana Jones is being shot at by German soldiers. But these kind of labels, I think, are challenging. What does South Asia mean? Where do we put Sri Lanka into that world? Where do we put Burma? Is this really totally distinct, for example, Burma, Myanmar, from Thailand? These regional divisions are extremely problematic. I've spent a lot of time in the last 12 months thinking about indigenous people's histories and learning a lot from how indigenous voices are much stronger in some parts of the world, particularly in Australia and the South Pacific region, but very influenced by those similar kinds of conversations happening in Central Asia at the moment around how do people reclaim their identities. And I don't particularly like Islamicate or Persian. I don't think they're particularly handsome words, but I think that they are problematic for lots of different reasons in terms of overwhelming ideas about minorities, about thinking about uniformities of beliefs or of culture or of language or of literature. And then, of course, even words like India are difficult. I find, and in today's new nationalisms where Indian histories are being told in new and different and quite aggressive ways, the idea of an Indian subcontinent that is somehow unified is about as imperialistic an idea as one can think of, given the realities not just of languages and identities in India, but in terms of the actual histories from Guptas, from Cholas, etc., Chalukyas, etc. The whole point about India is the incredible divergences and the flat labels that project a geographical unity, I think, are much, much more dangerous than our rather benign, quite useful Silk Roads that I choose to use, differently to some of my colleagues, but as a very amorphous, useful way to have an excuse to talk about connections. And those connections don't have to be long distance. It's a real problem, I think, in our field that often those ideas about Silk Roads are thought to be Mediterranean and China, and we miss out everybody in the middle. It's just a transit zone. But I'm very happy to think about things in that way. I mentioned about Orientalism, and I picked deliberately an article by a Chinese scholar and writer who, in fact, has jumped on those kinds of conversations that we have here in the West. But I find the Western insistence on not using Silk Road because it's somehow German or is designed to have romantic ideas by European historians not just wrong and unfair. I think it's actually specifically wrong, because when you start to go through the Dunhuang library cave and the materials that are there, very substantial, the word, in different languages, the word road comes up again and again and again. In the same way, in not just the Mahabharata, but in Sanskrit texts, you find the concept of kingship being very closely connected to control over roads. The Uttapasha and the Dakshinapatha Raja, the job is literally of the ruler to control security and trade along road systems. So as well as quite liking silk, I also quite like roads because it allows us to think about travel, trade, connections. Lots of roads are not very long. Some of them are, some of them aren't. This is supposedly northern-southern connections. These maps are very clumsy because they suggest there's a beginning and an end to things. But I think that the metrics works for me in terms of thinking about how do we conceptualize continuities. And those continuities are not consistent. There's no static moment in time where there wasn't change. New connections, new technologies, new ideas are spreading all the time. But it's also important to me that ideas about the Silk Roads are very strongly adopted in almost all of the countries we look at, except for India. And that has a lot to do with current conceptualizations around China. But here, Gurbanguly Berdimuhamedov, the DJing former president of Turkmenistan, this is his book that he wrote before he retired so he could hand on the job to his son. in Turkmenistan, like in most of the countries in Central Asia, you see the Silk Road as being something that's not a Chinese project. You see that it's proprietorial to the countries in question. I have here a readout from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Uzbekistan that Samarkand is the center of the world, or articles by Kazakh scholars thinking about how the territory of Kazakhstan is really the central part of the Silk Roads, and likewise here some Iranian scholars here from the Director of Cultural Heritage at the Iran Cultural Institute thinking about how the Silk Roads is an Iranian or Persian concept. And I think that those things are all fine. I think that they are quite useful. I mean, in fact, ironically, you now find competition between places like Iran, Turkey, and Pakistan about who is more Silk Road based than the other. And for us in Western institutions to deny the use of Silk Road terminologies and to insist that we should find better phrasings of Eurasia or Pan-Eurasian that excludes African contexts. In Frank and Sanchot's fantastic new maritime book, I do have that comes up at the end. The idea is about how do we make sure that other peoples in the Indian Ocean, in East Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, and so on, are not just pushed out by the insistence on Eurasian connections, I think is extremely important. So in terms of conceptualizing the Silk Roads, that's probably where I start, which is let it mean as much as you can, because there are more interesting things to think about. And I mentioned the challenge of terminologies. If you're going to have a fight, I mean, I would take on, for example, my own university, where classical languages means Latin and Greek. It doesn't mean Sanskrit. It doesn't mean Persian. It doesn't mean any language that isn't highly imperialist. In fact, here at your own university, they have changed now. So it's now called the Department of Ancient Greek Roman Studies. But then you go through the website, and let me see why did I put that there today? Berkeley is one of the outstanding in its field. It's supposed to say only does Latin and Greek. That must be the next paragraph. This one, I'm too polite to say which university, but it's a major US university. Classical civilization, the study of the culture, history, language, and literature of ancient Greece and Rome. Classical civilization doesn't include any other single part of the world. And that is, to me, much, much more problematic than some of the issues that I think we are thinking about. And that scrolls through. It's not just about Western civilization. It's not just about the classical world. I've got a couple of examples about to show how lopsided we are. So until around about 1400, there are probably more Christians in Asia than there are in Europe. And yet these books about medieval Christianity don't mention, the one on the right doesn't mention Constantinople at all, the Byzantine Church, the Orthodox Church. The one on the right, on your right, doesn't mention anything about churches that establish archbishoprics and bishoprics in Kashgar before there are in Canterbury. You find books about pilgrimage, the medieval journey to God, that don't mention the Hajj. You find texts about medieval history of medieval political thought, 50 key medieval thinkers. What have I got here? Not a single one of them in a non-Greek or Roman tradition, or Latin tradition, all Western European, none of them even from Eastern Europe either. Same with medieval technology. This means knights from Western Europe. And the Medieval World Complete is my favourite one, that has nothing that goes east of Poland or south of the Mediterranean. So those kinds of things mean that we set up our young people who go and work in different fields in the humanities to think about history and think about the past, perhaps in lopsided ways. I think things are, to be fair, better now than they were 20 or 30 years ago, but not much. And that means that you don't get time to think about why you have images of the Buddha here from Gandhara being served by Heracles on his left, his right, your left, looking up. We don't see how it is that art is influencing from Central Asia, being carried and linking and modifying between all different parts of our great world that we live on. Sometimes we have connections. As a project, I was a bit involved in a big exhibition called Empires of Faith, run by my colleague and friend Yash Elsner at Oxford at the Ashmolean, that was incredibly important in trying to think about global religions globally and to decenter away from Europe, to look at the North Atlantic as well as the Mediterranean, Indian Ocean and beyond. And these kinds of things are really hard to pull off in a convincing and compelling way because people's recognition of quite simple topics and visual images are pretty minimal. But the worlds you work on, if you work on things like the Silk Roads, you find things like the set of pots found made in North Africa in the Outer Hebrides in northern Scotland. You find these ceramic amphora, this one in Gaul in the museum, this one found in Shiraz in Iran. You find all these kind of images. You find shipwrecks, again, in the Indian Ocean with Chinese ceramics, Roman coins in northern India. These connections are so obvious, but you've got to open up your minds to be able to follow those. And that's why our subject is so exciting. I know some of you have been to Dunhuang, to Mogao caves, but here we have Mogao. These images here, does anyone have a guess where those are, where these come from? This is the Book of Kells, 11th century Central Ireland. And these representations are impossible, I think, to look at without being struck by how similar they are in terms of coloration, in terms of identification, in terms of visual imagery. And they speak, I think, to try to work out how these ideas are moving. And in fact, are they moving? Is this just a coincidence? Or here, Indian deities from 3 different sites. I'm not going to tell you which ones. One's Tanjore. I've just pointed at it, so I'm not going to tell you. But these ones, how do you retain visual insistence of what Indian deity looks like and how they're portrayed? How do you make that happen to produce uniformity across these 3 images? I find about 500 miles apart, about 300 years apart from oldest to youngest. How do you have standardization in a world where you don't have the internet, where you don't have the ability to be able to see what other people are doing, and yet it happens? How do you find technologies that are creating different kinds of ceramics for different kind of markers and different kinds of styles? And how similar or different are they? These kinds of things are bread and butter to us working on the Silk Roads, to think about soil clay types, to think about fabrications, how they're made, to think about workshops, to think about pricing, to think about distribution, to think about where they're being sold to, is, I think, what makes our subject so exciting. Then to think about how things like fashions I mentioned in the modern age, but we find the hen in the hat that is adopted in large parts of Europe through Mongol influences, or even very simple questions like these fantastic, beautiful paintings by Fra Angelico, dependent on lapis, dependent on vermilion, dependent on for the pigments that are not from Europe. How do they get there? What prices do they command? How are those global markets assessed? Those are incredibly exciting. Then we can think about disease environments. So you can see, what have I got here? The Mongols, the grey, thick arrows talking about Mongol expansion, and the long, thin lines about Black Death. And to this we can add, because of the excitement of what's happening in our field, in history, incredible new genomics. So we now think we're detecting Black Death pathogens on the Nile and in West Africa, probably in Congo and in Gabon. A colleague of mine about 6 months ago, or colleague of ours, I should say 6 months ago, also thinking that we had assumed that the Black Death had reasonably minimal impact in China, but new interpretation of texts to think that perhaps this spreads in more dynamic and more catastrophic ways than we thought. And of course, some of that connected through to climate anomalies, but also into the ideas that hyperconnectivity is highly linked to vulnerability. When people are moving goods, when they're moving themselves, when they're moving, that you find other things come along with them too. Exactly how the latest pandemic spread around the world, because we're very closely linked, everywhere 18 hours apart. This is a slightly slower connections, but it's fascinating, I think, to read and to work through what were the reasons why the Black Death pathogen Yersinia pestis spread across from probably plague foci in Kyrgyzstan, as a matter of fact. It's a slightly misleading arrow there, even though this is my old map, but to do with the fact that there were unusually high levels of shipment from the Black Sea for wheat because of crop failure in Italy in the 1330s. That opened up the gateway for high levels of infection. So some of those things make you think, I think, in slightly different ways. I mean, I'm not here to rehearse about why it is that all of our architecture from Germany and Australia and the United States look like Roman temples, but I think that oppression of what it means to have classical art in everywhere we look requires some of us to be working to push back and to try to open up new connectivities and tell different kinds of narratives. For example, about how Queen Victoria rather, became an empress. I didn't quite understand why, if it's a British empire, why was she Queen Victoria and not an empress? In fact, she was only given the imperial title in 1870, specifically to do with challenging Russia's claims. The Tsar's envoys, when he would arrive to present his credentials on behalf of the Tsar, had an 18-line readout of the Tsar's titles. And the British, being, like me, very modest, would just say, I'm here on behalf of Queen Victoria. And there were terrible arguments in Parliament with members of Parliament arguing about, it would be different in the United States if Trump was in charge. He'd have the longest one possible explaining who he was, but that to compete, the ways that titles are introduced, particularly in Central Asia, but also in other parts in China too, that the status really mattered. So those stories about the Silk Roads don't just end with, in the normal way, around about 1600. That's when most of our colleagues lose interest. Because at that point, Timurid, Mughal cultures have sagged. India becomes more separated from Central Asia, and there's not that much to write about. There are a few people, like fantastic Scott Levy, Oklahoma, working on things like emirates in Central Asia in the 17 and 1800s. But the excitement of trying to rethink about how these connections, what happens to them in the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries is extremely rewarding. And I'm going to show, for those of you who don't want to, I'm going to show, there's going to be an image of Osama bin Laden here as a warning for you if you don't want to look. But, you could see in many cases the second half of the 20th century was all about competition from a world that stretches from the Middle East right the way through, not just up to China, but also into China. We know about radicalization in Xinjiang province in the 1980s, and other maybe failed success story of the CIA, but around thinking about why do these heartlands come back time and time again. And then if you spend time in these parts of the world, as I do, you see the new world that's being born. And here, as one of my favorites, the Ministry of Home Affairs in Kazakhstan, there's a sister gold tanker next to it. And that matters because, as you'll probably know, about 200,000 people have been evacuated because of flooding in the last week in Kazakhstan. Some of the worst floods in Central Asian history, as bad, if not worse, than the ones that you'll have seen in Dubai in the newspapers. So these worlds are all interesting. They all matter. The fact that India sits outside the Silk Road's penumbra at the moment doesn't mean that they don't have connections into these worlds too. In fact, I do quite a lot of work looking at Indian military operations and collaborations with Central Asian states. Highly intensive, partly because of competition with Pakistan. So why bother? What are the thrills? And so I'm going to give a few simple examples about why I love what I do and why it's a privilege to think about a few big things. I'll start with a couple of easy ones. Sogdian letters, which Nicholas Sims Williams have translated. This one is about 1,500 years old. You can read it yourself. Minwei, a Sogdian woman. She never gets letters or answers to her letters. He never sends money. I obeyed your command and came to Dunhuang and didn't observe my mother's bidding nor that of my brothers. Surely the gods were angry with me on the day when I did your bidding. I would rather be a dog or a pig's wife than yours. Then we have one of my favorite. This is Onfim, a boy. This is on bark, practicing his handwriting with his friend, depicted here. And here you can just make out the bottom line. It says "Ya zvier," which means I'm a beast. Or I would say I'm a complete animal. That's what that sort of means. Then we can think about how the Taj Mahal is not just obviously classical Central Asian architecture, is probably the most single famous building possibly in Asia altogether, certainly in India, but this is recognizable immediately to the Central Asian influences and speaks not only to architectural styles, but also to the sudden wealth that blossoms into India as a result of its connections through up northwards, not just because of Babur and his family, born in Uzbekistan, but also to do with horses, with connections that allow Rajasthan and those great cities like Lahore, like Jaipur, like Jodhpur, to be built more or less from the ground up, round about 1700 onwards. The Silk Roads are absolutely booming. They just function in slightly different ways at that time. Now, my three examples, if I can count properly. First is something that I've been working on for a while, thinking about origins of early cities. So my Silk Roads book that I wrote starts roughly with Alexander the Great. It's the kind of classic moment of broad connections when Silk Roads sort of come into being. That's the kind of way which we usually think about it. And that sounds to me quite unconvincing about the fact that there's a kind of moment where the Silk Roads are established. And I think I write something probably a little bit too clumsy like that, because lots of my colleagues have written that. But thinking about what are the connections that link the worlds of Asia, Africa, and Europe together, and to some extent Australasia, before 300 BC, 100 BC, something like that. So I've done a couple of things thinking about that. One is about the distribution of crops and the role that nomadic peoples play, not so much in the diffusion of agricultural technologies, which is a little bit harder to show, but in terms of picking the genomics of plants to be able to see when they're starting to be sown in which parts, where and when. And particularly rice is quite a good vector to see where it started to be cultivated and when, because it gives a good signature. And that shows these connections are happening a lot earlier than we'd have thought, but also have a particularly important role for mobile peoples and mobile pathways. Then I was thinking around how do cities form? Why is it that we see urban densities start to form around about 4,500, 5,000 years ago? What is the sort of trigger? Is there a trigger? Are there single triggers? Is it just that there are more people and therefore there's rationalization and so on? But a new paper gives a very interesting idea around this. And this is about, I mean, forgive the scrappiness of the image, but it's about geospatial modeling, which I'll say something a little bit more about, but around where the kind of big first urban settlements are. So the Nile River is obviously one, the Tigris and Euphrates another, the Indus, and then the Yellow and Yangtze rivers are the particularly important ones. And to some extent, you have a little bit around the Danube too. I thought that this is probably to do with water. There's an ecological environment. All of these spaces are prescribed. So you've got good land, and then on either side of the good land, you either have mountains or deserts, or you have factors that stop expansion. So people get funneled into them. There are demographic booms, which is in itself problematic. It means you need to be producing more people than are dying. And that obviously has a calorific explanation to it. It also has a maternal healthcare explanation to it. It also has presumably some kind of connection between sedentary agriculture and different kinds of gathering of calories. But one thing that I think is really exciting is to think in terms of metal production. So these worlds are to do with where do you find metals, and the spread of metallurgical technologies, of new ideas of how to make things out of what materials, particularly copper and tin. You start to see quite interesting correlations. And as all of us historians spend all of our time saying, correlation and causation are two different things, which is absolutely right. But to think in terms of not only where do metals, how do they get used, it's also about the formation of elites. When you start to have high value goods that can be monopolized, call it AI in today's world, think about different kinds of resources, then you start to see different kind of patterns of how hierarchies start to establish. And then one of the questions that comes up is around the availability of labor forces, because the ability to both galvanize, reward, etc., start to be contemporaneous, not only with higher population densities, but also with more socioeconomic inequality and gender inequality. And the fact that these happen at roughly the same times in all these places, in the kind of major civilization cradles, doesn't mean that you necessarily have to explain them by having somebody who walks between the two or sails between the two. But the commonality of the adoption of metallurgy across a pretty narrow chronological time frame gives us an enormous amount to think about. I think it's incredibly exciting to be bombarded with new ideas to make you think. Here, as it happens from the Atlas of Chinese Relics, you see archaeological sites and their distributions, and you can have a lot of fun with these kinds of things to think about how that maps into current Chinese population densities, previous population densities, but also why is it that we find these sites? How do we link them to availabilities? And then because like I said, I've been working a bit on cities. This is in Babylon. I mean, it's reconstructed, obviously. But one of the questions is why do these big cities, including in the first big major conurbations are in what's now Ukraine and southern Russia. You find mega sites long before you find the kind of glory cities that take the credit along the Nile or Mesopotamia. But this one, Babylon, the walls are much, much too big for any form of military assault. There's no potential way in which these offer any form of, there's any way of possibly breaking in through some kind of conquest or siege. So the question is, why do big cities have walls? And I'm involved in a project we're working on with a couple of sites in Uzbekistan this summer. And some of the questions are do these offer environmental protection, particularly against sandstorms, but to some extent against, in some locations, possibly against rising water levels. Places like Jericho in Israel have an opportunity to think that that's to do with water protection. But even so, even if they're protecting against sand, it's a question of are there other alternative or parallel explanations. One is that there's the sort of brotherhood of kings, that once one person builds an enormous big set of walls like this, then rival cities need to do the same to compete. And I wouldn't think that that's implausible. Sounds perfectly compelling. The other one is to think around whether, in fact, these walls are not to keep people out, but they're to protect the single most important commodity in all of human history, which is human labor forces, and to keep them in. And the competition is to provide fortifications that make sure that you have availability of labor. And we find similar patterns in most of the big cities in the kind of Silk Road worlds. The places we don't are in the Indus Valley. And one explanation for that might be, sounds to me plausible, but we're working on that at the moment with a small little group, is perhaps because the way that the Saraswati, because the way that the rivers that come down from the Himalayas, because they carry so much silt, they move their location more or less on a yearly basis. So it means that availability of the best land changes. If you're between the Tigris and Euphrates, like if you play Monopoly, I don't know whether young people, do you know what Monopoly is as a board game? You know, whatever the video game equivalent is, there's the best place to start, right? There's the bit that's more valuable. I guess, I don't know Berkeley well, I've only been here for 24 hours. If you could choose where you'd have your house, that's where you'd pick. But if that place changes, and the neighborhood is constantly on the move, then other things flow. For example, in Indus Valley habitations, sizes of houses are very consistent. You don't find large houses near the best land, which you do in every single city we've excavated. Every single city that has been excavated in more traditional locations in the Nile and Mesopotamia and so on, where hierarchy and elites play different kinds of roles to Indus Valley. So that's one kind of big question to then think about. What are the interesting questions to ask? What kind of materials and tools do we want and need to be thinking about how to develop some of those sort of proto ideas? Which ones of those are superficial bad ideas that need to be clubbed to death and left on the floor, right? Because one of the things about academia and about the academic world is to go into dead ends and then to trace your way back out. So that's one thing that I think is keeping me and some of us very excited. Another one is around the ideas about identity, and that's important in today's world for other reasons too. Amazingly, of the kind of 60 mega empires in history that have had more than 1 million kilometers squared, and that's a rough estimate. We don't have maps. It's quite hard to work out exactly what that means. But some of the geospatial stuff shows that about 85% of all global empires and major empires are established next door to the steppe lands. And those of us who work on Central Asia in particular, keen to not just think about oases and cities, but to think about other different pathways and lifeways, different traditions, different ways of recording, writing, histories. And we need to find some good explanations for some of that. I mean, one case, for example, with every single unification event in the histories of China, the many different kinds of Chinas there are, every single one, apart from the Ming, is a unification event, comes from the north, from pressures from mobile pastoralists, presumably a combination of opportunism, but one other thing that's, and also of ability to insert into domestic politics. But one of the things that I think is particularly interesting around that is what threats from the steppe lands do to national or state identities, and the ideas around ultra-sociability that you get galvanized not by creating common bonds, but by reacting to threats. And I'm interested in that because I'm a soccer fan, and every 4 years there's a World Cup. And in my country, where we're at each other's throats all the time, everybody lines up behind a flag when we're playing against, well, ideally we play against Argentina. That's our favourite, or the Scots, if you're English. But that idea that finding common pressures create unity is, I think, quite an interesting idea, both in terms of proto-histories and early stuff, but, pick a period, pick a region, pick a subject, whether you're thinking about the Mongols, whether you're thinking about the Khmer, whether you're thinking about the Sasanians, whether you think about Russia and Central Asia in the 19th century. Those kinds of ideas, I think, are quite interesting to explore. And people like Walter Scheidel just up the road in Stanford and Peter Turchin, I think, thinking through in quite dynamic, interesting ways about how to ask some of those really important, big questions. And I think that those are fantastically interesting. They're like all kind of stop at the traffic lights moment when you think, how have I not thought about the roles that empires play by being galvanized by external factors, and how those play roles into mobilizing things like horses in the case of the Mongols in terms of creating cities, defenses, and so on. Then the last case, I thought I should say something about environmental histories, because that's what I've been working on for the last 10 years or so in particular. And to give just one example, this is to do with a single volcanic eruption in the 1780s in Laki in Iceland, just at the top of the picture, with weather maps, and here some charts done by on summer mean temperatures. And why these are significant is that in this particular window, where you have mean temperature falls of quite substantial amounts, well outside the variable range. Here, this is where the eruption happens. The ejection of materials into the atmosphere blocks the sun's rays, and also the sulfur reacts with moisture in the atmosphere to then deflect radiation. So typically you find lower levels of sunlight, lower levels of temperature, and of course, if you remember your biology lessons, compromised photosynthesis. That means that crop levels are lower. In some cases, it plays havoc with rainfall patterns too, which is what seems to happen with the case of Laki. There's a volcanic eruption happening in Indonesia at the moment that went off yesterday morning as I was flying in. And that's been categorized as a VEI, Volcanic Explosivity Index 5, about the same size as the Hunga Tonga eruption of 2022 that has had an impact on our climate patterns at the moment, including while you're lucky to have had 2 years of good rainfall here in California. So how they're very complicated, how they interact. We have to be very careful about how to look at those. But in the case of the 1780s, 1784 and 1785, you find failure of the Nile flood. And why that's significant as a historian to think about things like that is that what flows from that is uprisings of Egyptian elites who refuse to pay their taxes. So the Sultan in Constantinople, the Ottoman Sultan in Constantinople, sends a major army to go and restore order in 1786 and 1787. And that's the moment where Catherine the Great decides to occupy Crimea. And that has a significance in today's world too, where we're told that Crimea has always been Russian. A friend of mine who used to be president of Mongolia says you can give it back to the Mongols because we had that for a lot longer than the Russians did. But he hasn't had a reply to his email. But thinking about whether it's country specific, whether it is event specific, whether it's some of the bigger existential questions about how do identities form, whether it's about why they're the first cities, how do people trade, what are they buying and selling, that Silk Road's umbrella gives us so much space to be able to run around and have a lot of fun. I was saying at lunch, the challenges are that you need to have technical skills to handle some of this material. It's very tempting to go with the big picture materials without having the detail and discipline. My greatest luck, I think, was that I spent 20 years in complete obscurity with no one inviting me to Berkeley or anywhere else to come and talk. First lecture I ever gave at Harvard, I only had 3 people turn up. I had the head of the history faculty, the head of the humanities, and the person who invited me in Byzantine studies. So I don't need a big audience, but it meant that I had the chance to spend my time in the trenches doing proper work. And then it's much easier to flap your wings. It's very hard to do global without having the detail. And for me, it matters to have the point on form. But those Silk Roads give us the scope, if you want to look at individual regions, peoples, periods. I think it's important that there is scope to think beyond periodization, to think beyond regions. You don't have to join up everything all the time. But as I get older and closer to retirement, some of those kind of bigger questions are ones that are particularly interesting for me around things like disease environments. Why is it that sometimes you find vectors that will transmit and sometimes you don't? What is it that makes cities fail? Difficult things to be thinking about, but they're very rewarding if you do. So, I think it's incredible that you have fantastic new scholarship across every kind of thing. And I could have picked almost anything, but here Shadrach Chikuru writing about how we should be thinking, forget about Silk Roads, we should be thinking about ivory routes. I think it's just fantastic to have it pointed out that we need to be more inclusive, however much we're thinking about different regions, that the new polar world that's changing around us because of sea ice, you don't have to call it a Silk Road, but in fact, if you're thinking about trade, if you're thinking about vulnerabilities, if you're thinking about different ways of connections being made and linking one part of a global landmass with others, I'm totally okay about that as a label. And if you can think of a better one, the Arctic Sea Route is absolutely fine by me. This is a Chinese classification. There's also a Chinese Silk Road for oral health care, by the way. And here, John Hillman, who's a friend of mine, writing about pointing out that in today's world, connections are not just regional, local, and built. They're also about much higher levels of connectivity, and particularly in the digital space where so much happens without us even thinking. And one of the things that you might have seen in the last 10 days is that there's been the entire digital infrastructure behind AI, including a trapdoor into entire global digital infrastructure, was detected 10 days ago by someone running routine maintenance on the whole of our global digital architecture with a trapdoor that essentially allowed, it was supposed to be a single individual, almost certainly a state actor, the ability either to collapse all digital infrastructure or to be able to use that trapdoor to be able to look at anything, anywhere, at any point, at any time. And so thinking about digital Silk Roads, about how those connectivities can lend to trade, to tolerance, to happiness, to cooperation, but also can be the vectors for the spread of new technologies, for violence, for global pandemics. That's something that we see the light and the dark. So I think it's a fantastic thing that you have a Silk Road Centre here that gives the chance to attract young and not young talent to come and talk to you and to have a chance to encourage us that there are loads of us in our field who are trying to think about connectivities, to ask some of those big questions and to have a thought about how we might do history in the future, because that's completely changed since I was a graduate student. Now, to think about history involves thinking about biology and genomics. To think about migration, some of those big questions that we were hearing about with the conference in October that I did check my inbox. I didn't get an invitation to. I'm joking. But those big questions, we have a whole new set of tools that we can look at some of these things. We can measure what people are eating. We can measure dental cavities. We can measure athletic prowess. So we can see that women working in Mesopotamia 3,000 years ago had upper body strength equivalent or better to than modern Olympic athletes. Right, those kinds of things are just unbelievably exciting as a scholar. We are living in a golden age. So I'm hugely grateful to those who support the Silk Road Study Centre here, to the Tang family in particular for their patronage, for those of you who come to hear me talk this afternoon, and also for the very generous invitation to come here in the first place. So thank you all very much.